Well, all right. It's great to see everyone out today. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Hope that the service so far has been a blessing to you and that we're going to say something in the next few minutes that will encourage you, will challenge you, will drive you closer to the heart of Jesus, because that's what we want to be about. Romans chapter 12, verse 21. We read it together earlier, but I just want to remind you of what it says again, because it's so important for where we're going today as we look deeper into the life of Samson. The Apostle Paul simply says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, for the last 3 weeks, we have looked at the life of Samson from a 10,000-foot view. And today we're going to begin to kind of dig a whole lot deeper into the story and the life of this incredible character that we read all about in the book of Judges. And this morning, I want to begin with a critically important lesson that we need to get right, that Samson so completely and so totally got wrong. And that is this concept of overcoming evil with good. Now, we know that Samson's first encounter with death is a young lion when he's on his way to Timnah in Judges chapter 14. We know that about his life. He disregards the Spirit's counsel, as we talked about last week, and he rips this lion to shreds, to pieces, and he makes a riddle out of it during a wedding feast. We know the story. Ultimately, the riddle gets solved, and Samson loses the bet, and he has to pay up 30 changes of clothes. And once again, disregarding the Spirit's counsel, he storms off and he kills 30 people, stripping them of their clothes. He heads back to the party and settles the debt. Boiling with anger, he heads back to his home in Timnah, in the valley of Escalation. And in Judges 15, then, we really begin to see these events take place that lead to this incredible life that Samson has. Take a look at Judges 15, verse 1 with me. And it says, after some days, Judges 15, verse 1, after some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, "I will go into my wife in the chamber," but her father would not allow him to go in. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. Samson's father-in-law assumes that the marriage is over. And what he does when he assumes the marriage is over is he gives his daughter to the best man of the wedding. And we know that. We know that makes sense, not the giving of the wife to the best man, but the assumption that the marriage was over. Because Samson had to kill 30 people as a result of losing this bet due to his daughter's actions, and then he left her alone in Timnah while he returned back to his own house. Take a look at verse 2. His father says, "I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." That word utterly hated that you read there in Scripture, if you want to underline that, that's an important word. It's the Hebrew word sane or sane, which carries divorce implications in the ancient Near East. And so that's what's going on here. And Samson, when he hears the news that his wife has been given away, gets angry again. He disregards his father-in-law's suggestion to take the younger daughter instead. And then Samson says something very interesting in verse 3. Notice these words. He says, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. This time I'll be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So here's Samson's attitude. Somebody does him wrong, and he immediately feels justified in retaliating back, in striking back, in biting back. That's revenge. Revenge is the action of inflicting hurt or harm on somebody for an injury or wrong suffered at their hands. Samson believes that he has been wronged, and so he is angry. He is ticked off, and he wants justice. And according to verse 3, he's going to go get that justice. He's going to go get his revenge because he has a right to get even. So put this together with me. Samson wants justice because his wife was given to another guy as a result of himself storming off, murdering 30 Philistine men for losing a silly bet, a bet, I may remind you, that made possible only by the fact that Samson blatantly broke his Nazirite vow. You see, this is what's so scary about revenge. We get so, I don't know what the right word is, we get so bent on getting even. We fail to take into consideration the larger story and our part in it. All we can see is this, man, I got to get back. I got to get him back. I got to get him back. And we don't recognize what we have done to be a part of the problem. We begin to believe that our retaliation is justifiable and that we are somehow innocent. In fact, the word translated innocent or get even here in verse 3 actually means blameless. So get this with me. In Samson's mind, regardless of the fact that he killed 30 people to pay off this bet, in Samson's mind, he not only has a right to administer this vengeance, but he will be blameless when he does so. Getting even for Samson looks like going out, catching 300 jackals, which had to have been quite an ordeal. I wish I could have seen what that looked like. Tying their tails together, putting a torch in the knot of the tail, and turning them loose in the standing crops of the Philistines. Listen to verse 4 and 5 with me. It says, so Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain as well as the olive orchards. Now, we read through that and we pass over that and we don't give much thought to that, but here's what that means. To say that Samson burned up the stacks and the standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves means that Samson utterly destroyed not only the summer crops, but the winter crops as well. And in an agricultural society like theirs, this would have absolutely decimated their economy. It would have decimated their livelihood. It would have removed completely their food supply. And this is wrong on so many angles, but let me just remind you of what Scripture says in Exodus chapter 22. It's a very interesting passage in verse 6. Here's what it says. Let me read it for you. It says, listen to this. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain of a field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. Didn't know that was there, did you? And so Samson has no intention of making restitution for what he did. He is thrilled at the mayhem that is going on all around him. And now the Philistines, who are unable to harm the man responsible, seek revenge for this catastrophe. And you know what they do? They take his wife and they take his father-in-law and they burn them to death. And so what started out as a simple dispute between Samson and his father-in-law has now quickly elevated and escalated into an entire city losing their source of livelihood and 2 people being burned alive. This is what getting even looks like for Samson, whose actions are blameless. Blameless in his own eyes. And he's not even close to being finished yet. In fact, Samson is just getting warmed up. Listen to what he says after they burn his father-in-law and his wife. Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I'll quit. Really? Really? Since you act like this, Samson says about the Philistines. Because setting the valley on fire was a mature and civilized response to a personal dispute, right? I mean, come on. Since you act like this, he says to the Philistines, and he takes no regard for his own actions. Do you see how Samson loves to shift the blame? Don't you see us doing the exact same thing? Maybe it's not at this level, but doing the exact same thing. It's always somebody else's fault. When do we take responsibility for our actions? It's always somebody else did this, and so that's why I did this. Samson's demonizing the actions of others while maintaining his own innocence in the midst of all of this. And since he's been wronged, he believes he has a right to get even, and this justifies yet another round of revenge. And notice that he says, after this, I'll quit. This will be the end. This is going to be the last one, but it's not that easy. You see, Samson has an inflated sense of his own control, and that is what revenge does to us. It makes us believe that we can engage in it whenever we want and quit whenever we want. The problem is we can't do that. Revenge is alluring. Retaliation is intoxicating. It gets into our blood and it takes over. We don't control revenge. Revenge controls us. And that's what God is trying to address in Exodus 21 and verse 24 when he gives us these instructions. Do you remember these? When God says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is what he's trying to address. This very thing that Samson doesn't get at all. It's called the Lex Talionis. And its purpose was to eliminate the escalation of violence that was rampant in the social fabric of society. And without the Lex Talionis, without such a law, revenge would always escalate. Here's what it would look like. Without an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you broke my arm, I'm going to kill your daughter. That's what it looks like in a society where an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not revered and held up. What that means is that Lex Talionis is actually a form of grace, because it limited what could be exacted or reduced the chaos and pain that would come from this endless cycle of retaliation and retribution. And Samson has no reference for such a purpose. He has no thought whatsoever for the things of God. In response to the Philistines' retaliation, look at what Samson does in Judges 15:8. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Edom. He kills an unidentified amount of people. This is his justification for doing what he does. And as you might imagine, Samson breaks his vow again, and he flees 18 miles in the opposite direction to the town of Lehi. The Philistines then follow Samson to the region of Judah, and they lie in wait. As you might imagine, the people of Judah are alarmed by this sudden influx of Philistines, and they ask, what's going on? And Judges 15:10 tells us, why have you come against us? And they said, we have come to bind up Samson. Listen, to do to him as he did to us. Do you see it? Over and over. I'm doing this to them because they did it to me. Well, I'm doing this to you because you did it to me. I'm doing it. On and on and on and on it goes. And now more than 3,000 people have been pulled into this drama. Revenge has a way of doing that, doesn't it? The longer it goes on, the more people get sucked into it. And so what began as a civil pursuit is now out of control. And notice what Samson says back to them in verse 11. He says, then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock at Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are ruler over us? What then is this you have done to us? And he said to them, as they've done to me, I've done to them. I don't remember what movie it was. Maybe it was Men in Black. Will Smith says, don't start none, won't be none, right? Samson started this. As they've done to me, so I've done to them. I just did to them, Samson says, what they did to me. And Jesus comes along and he says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, whatever you want others to do to you, do to them. We call it the golden rule. And it's so completely opposite of Samson, isn't it? If you look a little bit further into Matthew 7:12, it says, for this, doing to people as you would want done to you, that's the law and the prophets. All of it hinges on this attitude. But yet, Samson says, I just did what they want to do, what they did to me. Jesus says, do to others as you want them to do to you. Samson says, I just did what they did to me. And Samson then takes a jawbone of a freshly killed donkey, which he probably killed himself, and kills 1,000 more Philistines before he retires. Fast forward 20 years, Samson is at it again in the presence of Gaza. Seeking revenge, the Philistines hire Delilah, and we're going to talk all about this next week, to get the inside scoop into Samson's strength. And after several rounds, he gives in, and his hair is cut, and his eyes are gouged out, and they take him back to Gaza. And listen to this, Judges 16, verse 20. Samson says, but he did not know, or it says of Samson, he did not know that the Lord had left him. Isn't that an interesting commentary? He didn't even know. He still thinks his actions are blameless. He still thinks he's innocent. He still thinks he's in the right. He doesn't even know that God left him. And what we find next is Samson hanging between two pillars. And listen to how his prayer begins in verse 28 of Judges chapter 16. Samson says, "Oh Lord, please remember me and please strengthen me this once." And it would be very easy for us if it stopped there. It would be easy for us to say, well, look at this. Samson's coming around. He's finally recognizing his failings. He sincerely wants to salvage some aspect of his dignity, and he's calling on God to do what God desires. But no, that's not exactly what's going on here. Look at the next phrase. "Oh, Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me this once. Oh God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It seems that nothing has changed. Samson still has vengeance on his heart and vengeance on his mind. It's in his veins. He's thinking only of himself. He wants revenge for the humiliation he suffered at the hands of the Philistines, and he's asking God to help him on his own personal vendetta. And while other figures in the Bible ask God for help to do something significant, they do so for God's honor and not for their own. I mean, think about this. Think about David as he fights Goliath. Does he say, "God, I want you to beat down this giant so that all of this mocking and humiliation that he's giving of Israel, so we can stop that"? No, he says, I want this giant defeated so that the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Solomon, as he's dedicating the temple, he pleads with God to hear his prayer and the people, and he says, "Here's why I want you to hear the prayer, God, so that all the people of the earth may know your name and fear you." When Elijah is dueling with the prophets of Baal, he fervently cries, "So that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are alone, our Lord, O God." This is the purpose. This is the reason that the Hall of Fame of Faith folks, even though Samson's there, and we'll talk about that, even though that's there, this is what they want. They want God to be praised. They want God to be glorified. They want God to be lifted up. Samson says, "I want revenge for my 2 eyes. I want revenge." So that being said, as we talked about last week, I'm not convinced that God answers Samson's prayer. Samson's strength was connected to his hair. His hair began to grow again, and when he's in the temple courts, he thought, man, I just want enough strength to do this. He doesn't know that he has enough strength to do it on his own. He's not sure, and so in order to ensure his revenge, he asked God for help. And we see what happens in verses 29 and 30. So what began as a single lion ends with at least 3,000 Philistines being destroyed in this tragedy at Gaza. This is the trajectory of revenge when the cycle continues unbroken. And I believe that the writer of Judges is doing everything in his power to demonstrate what happens when someone gives in to the alluring nature of revenge and how it derails our lives on such a serious basis. And now, for some of us, we're going to look at the story of Samson, and it's going to be deeply convicting. You're going to see your part in something like this. Maybe not like this, but others of you are going to read this story, and you're going to say, I'm so glad I'm not like that. But I wonder how often do we do the same thing that Samson did? Maybe not killing folks. But how often do we do the same thing? How often do we exact a punishment beyond what has been done to us? How often do we get back at someone for something they have done to us? And again, maybe our revenge doesn't look like Samson's, but we know how to get back at the people around us, don't we? We give the silent treatment or the cold shoulders. Husbands, wives, am I speaking your language yet? You don't like something he or she did, and so it becomes withholding whatever needs to be withheld, silent treatment, cold shoulder until you get your way or you get your stuff satisfied. Here's a big one. I despise social media. I believe it's a necessary evil. I try to use it for good, but I absolutely hate it. I wish it didn't exist. Because how often, under the guise of secrecy or anonymity, Do we beat someone down on the internet, on Facebook, and we post something ridiculous, something cruel, something incriminating? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We don't care. We just want to throw it out there. Aren't we just like Samson when we do that? He said something wrong to me. I'm going to let everybody know about what he did to me. We pass along gossip, regardless of whether it's true or not, church. Are you hearing me? This cannot be a place of gossip. It's what the world thinks it is. This cannot be a place where that reigns and lives and exists and breathes and moves. It can't. We make derogatory comments about a boss because we don't like the review that he gives us. We craft a deeply penetrating email that rips the recipient to shreds. We cut someone off in traffic. We shut someone out of a will. We go for the jugular when we get into an exchange with someone. We're Samson. Oh, yeah, we're not killing people. We're not taking donkeys' bones and ripping people to shreds, but we're Samson. It could be 1,000 different things. This list could go on and on and on. And every time they do that, every time we do that, we exhibit the same barbaric mentality that Samson does. And we all know what it's like to be wronged. Every one of us knows that. It hurts. It stinks. When it happens, it's natural for us to want to bite back, but it's destructive. There is no redeeming value to personal revenge. None whatsoever. And yet the last thing we want to do is nothing. But Paul gives us in Romans 12, I want you to go with me there now. Paul gives us exactly what we need to hear in Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 19. He says, repay no one. Anyone left out of no one? It doesn't say repay only the people you don't like. Your mother-in-law. It doesn't say anything like that, does it? I like my mother-in-law. Don't misunderstand. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself. Never avenge yourself. But leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. What's the bottom line? Let God do his job. Last I checked, you weren't him, and neither am I. Paul doesn't say that revenge isn't necessary. He doesn't say that there's not a need there. He doesn't push aside and say, it's not necessary. No, revenge is a form of justice. But it is how it is administered and by whom it is administered that makes it either a positive or a negative thing. And so Paul reminds us of two very important things here. Number one, he says, listen, nothing that happens goes unnoticed. Nothing. And even though it may feel like that, even you may feel like you're getting trampled on, I want you to know this morning, nothing that happens to you goes unnoticed. Ever. Period. God is profoundly aware of our situations, and he will deliver justice according to his perfect wisdom and his unclouded judgment. That's what he does. God is a God of justice, and he promises to act, even though we may not always appreciate his timing. Here's the second truth. Vengeance isn't ours to execute. It is not our place to do that. When we overstep our bounds, the resulting act is rarely, if ever, just, even if we think it might be in our own heads. It's why Paul says, don't repay evil with evil, because he understands our response is going to take the form of evil, regardless of how justified we think we are in doing whatever it is we're doing. Beyond that, the larger issue with revenge is this. When we step in and play the role of avenger, what we are doing is we're saying, God, I can do a better job than you can. I can do it better than you. Oh, we'd never come out and say that, but our actions betray us. Because to take revenge is to take the place of God. To retaliate is to take the place of God. And when we are wronged, the invitation is to trust that God is fully capable of doing His job. When we are wrong, we're supposed to allow Him to do only what He's capable of doing correctly, and that is to be the administrator of justice. And Jesus, oh, Jesus. Why do you got to throw Him into the picture? He always does it right. Yes, He does. 1 Peter 2:23. When He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. Jesus takes it a step further in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Remember this? You've heard that it was said, Lex Talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, don't even resist the one who's evil. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other one also. Verse 43, you've heard it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Jesus doesn't want His people, that's us, last I checked, right? He doesn't want us to respond with revenge or retaliation. Jesus says, don't retaliate unless that retaliation is an outpouring of love, because that's how Jesus responds to us. May I remind you of Luke chapter 23. Father, He says, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. That is our model. That is what we should do. Now, most of us are familiar with Matthew 18, where Peter comes to Jesus and he's asking, all right, Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive my brother? Do I need to do it up to 7 times? And you need to know, Peter thought he was doing something significant when he said 7 times. And Jesus blows him out of the water and says, no, it's not 7 times. It's 77 times. 77 times. And there's something significant at play here. I want you to go back to Genesis 4, because Jesus is reminding us, when He says the word 77, He's reminding us of something that happened early in biblical history. If you remember, in Genesis chapter 4, we read about a guy named Lamech. You remember this guy? He's a piece of work, to put it mildly. You thought Cain was bad. Lamech is far worse. And listen to the arrogance of Lamech, as he says in verse 23 of Genesis 4. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. This is my best Lamech impersonation that I can give you. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. Ladies, you're pretty lucky to have... That's not in there. I'm just adding that. You're pretty lucky to have me as your husband. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, you see what he says? Look at it. Then Lamech's is 77-fold. Lamech took revenge to unprecedented levels. He went far beyond what was conceivable, and then he boasted of his passion for exacting this kind of revenge, all reflected in the number 77. And so when Jesus says, forgive someone 77 times, here's what He wants. He wants His followers to exemplify the same kind of relentless passion and thirst for forgiveness that Lamech did for vengeance. He wants us to be the exact same way, but different. Not with revenge, but with forgiveness. Jesus says, go above and beyond. Be endlessly forgiving. And I know that is hard, but that is what God has done for us. And here's the problem. Let me just preach for a minute. One of our problems is that I don't really think we understand what forgiveness actually is. I don't think we understand the nature of forgiveness. And if we would just understand what forgiveness is, then maybe our ability to forgive would be greatly increased. And so I want to quickly run through what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. Let's begin with what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not condoning what happened. When you forgive someone, you're not saying that what happened to you is okay. It's not agreeing with it. It's not sweeping it under the rug. It's not excusing it. If something needs to be forgiven, it's because it is significant enough to warrant forgiveness in the first place. And so forgiveness is not condoning what happened. Forgiveness is also, number two, not forgetting what happened. That's not biblical to say we need to forgive and we need to forget. It's not true. And when we get rid of these little cliches about what forgiveness is, we may be in a better place where we're willing to forgive. The Bible never calls us to forget. It certainly calls us to forgive. Now, this doesn't mean that you and I get to continually remind the people who hurt us over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, but it does mean that we're not naive to the fact that it may happen again or that it happened in the first place. You can forgive, but that doesn't mean that things are ever going to go back to the way they were. And that leads me to number three. Forgiveness is not always reconciling. Reconciliation is the goal. That's what we want. That's what we strive for. But forgiveness isn't dependent upon reconciliation. Forgiveness is a one-way street. Reconciliation is a two-way street. Forgiveness doesn't require a response from the other party. The decision to forgive is yours and yours alone. I have a story that I don't know that I should share with you. Maybe second service will get it. Number four, forgiveness is not forgoing legal ramifications. You understand what I mean by that, right? When you forgive, that doesn't mean that the justice system that we have in our country needs to be removed from the process. No. There are consequences for our actions, and when someone does something that requires legal ramifications, forgiveness doesn't cancel out punishment from legal action. That is what forgiveness is not. And when we understand better what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't, I'm hoping that we're going to be a more forgiving people. So let's talk now about what forgiveness is. The very definition of forgiveness means to release or to be set free. And so forgiveness is releasing or setting someone free. And when we read that, we think that we're talking about the person who has done the wrong. And yes, that's part of it, but there's more to it than that. If you've been hurt by someone and you're unwilling to forgive them, who's hurt more by our lack of forgiveness than they are? We are. I love this. One author said it this way. You're going to like this. You're going to want to write this down. I'll get your pens out. This is really good. Not forgiving is like eating rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. Isn't that good? Let me say it again, so I know you want to write that down because that's huge. Not forgiving is like eating rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. To release or set free. Forgiveness is letting go of our desire for revenge. It's giving up our plots to get even. I don't know if you're like me. Oh, I am so in need of the grace of Almighty God. Somebody does something to me, and I run over and over in my head how I'm going to respond. What I'm going to say if I get an opportunity to be in His presence. And I sit there and I lie awake all night long running the worst possible scenarios. Am I speaking your language? And it just takes my joy, it takes my peace, it takes my sleep, it takes all of those things away. And then guess what starts happening? And then I start biting at my family, I start biting at my wife. You thought I was a nice guy. Oh, no. That's what it does to me. And so when I forgive, I've got to let that go. I've got to give up my plots to get even. It's no longer harboring a grudge. It's letting go of my bitterness and my anger and my rage. It's handing people over to God and trusting He's going to ultimately take care of it. That's what forgiveness is. Number 3, forgiveness is a process. Just because we're supposed to forgive doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. It takes time, so don't rush the process, or you're going to end up not forgiving someone and pretending that you did, and it's going to be this crazy place that we find ourselves in. And let me just say, that's where I think most of us find ourselves in the church. We get wronged by a brother, and we say we forgive, but we really haven't, and so there's still this hatred and this anger and this animosity and this bitterness that continues to build up and go up and rise up at a drop of a hat. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness is painful. It's going to cost you something. In fact, one of the Hebrew words that gets translated to forgive literally means to lift up, to carry, to take, or to bear. I've got to bear this. Bottom line, forgiveness is a great idea until you have to forgive someone. And then it becomes really, really difficult. And I don't know about you, but there are times when I just don't have the strength to forgive. I'd rather not. It's not that I want to enter into revenge. It's that I just don't often have what it takes to forgive. I understand the nature of forgiveness. I know how much God has forgiven me. But that doesn't mean that I'm automatically able to forgive someone else. I struggle. Maybe you do too. And yet Jesus still tells me to forgive 77 times. And so there's something here that we need to see about forgiveness. And this leads to the last thing I want to say, and that's this. Forgiveness has a source. Forgiveness has a source. On my strength, it's very difficult to forgive. But God is the God of all strength, and God is also the source of all forgiveness. And so if we want to be people who are capable and who are able to forgive 77 times, then we need to be conduits through which the source of forgiveness can pass. You following me? We need the strength of Christ to flow through us if we're going to live out lives of forgiveness. And so we've got to ask the God of forgiveness for the resources to do for others what He has done for us. Because He is the source of it all. And Samson, he missed it all. He completely missed it all. We're all going to be wronged. We're all going to get hurt. But we don't have to play the part of victim. We don't have to fall into the destructive cycle of vengeance, retaliation, biting back. We can choose to forgive. We can get right what Samson got wrong. So the question is, will you? Will you get right what Samson got wrong? Will you show a watching world something different than what's normal? Will you not just wear the name Christian, but will you display those Christian attitudes on a regular and consistent basis to the people around us? That's the question. Let's get right what Samson got wrong. If you're here today and maybe retaliation has been on your heart and it's been ruining your life, let's repent. Let's take care of it. Let's get rid of it. If you're here today and you're in need of Jesus Christ in any possible way, whether that's beginning your walk with Him, getting rid of sin in your life, whatever it might be, we want to help you. We want to pray for you. We want to be the hands and feet of Jesus to you. So why don't you come right now while we sing this song for your encouragement?
Lay your burden down.